in this panel. I've been looking forward to this. This is a subject which I cover in my day job all the time. We are seeing big companies, no matter how big you are, you're not immune from this, getting breached, getting hacked. And of course, unfortunately for them, it's my job to bring that news to the public. So I'm going to introduce you to the panel in a second, but I firstly wanted to read out the blurb for this panel, just to make sure you're in the right place and give you an idea of what's to come. So, with the ever-increasing use of data and number of digital threats to organizations, data breaches are unfortunately commonplace. With more staff working from home, increasing the threat of a breach, organizations more than ever need to ensure the appropriate security measures are in place. So we've got an expert panel for you assembled from around the world. I'll introduce them now. Cosimo Monda is talking to us from the Netherlands. He is, hi Cosimo, how are you?
Hi, hello, hi, nice to meet you.
Cosimo is director of the Maastricht European Centre on Privacy and Cybersecurity at the ECPC. His work has a strong European and international outlook in the field of privacy and cybersecurity, steering an interdisciplinary group of researchers, academics and professionals. We have Dr. Saif Abid talking to us from London.
Hi, how are you, Joe?
Very well, thank you. Saif is a medical doctor and healthcare cybersecurity and national security expert. He's currently a founding partner and director of cybersecurity services at Abid Graham Group. And that's the name of the company, isn't it? There you go. I've got the rest of my notes here. Europe's leading exclusively clinically based healthcare cybersecurity consultancy. Did I get that right, Dr. Saif?
That's perfect, Joe. Perfect.
Right. We've also got Gal Ringel from Israel. He's co-founder and CEO of Mine. Gal has a rare background in cybersecurity, entrepreneurship, and venture capital. And Gal also, interestingly, received the #1 spot in the Forbes 30 Under 30 in 2017. Hi, Gal.
Hi, thank you for having me, Joe.
Pleasure. We've got Danny Jenkins, CEO of ThreatLocker. Danny is a technical guru with a deep understanding of corporate IT and cybersecurity. He has an entrepreneurial background and 2 decades of experience in building and securing corporate networks. How you doing, Danny?
Good morning, Joe.
Is that your logo in the back there?
It is, yes.
Very slick. I like that. Well done. And last but not least, Simon Taylor, who is partner at Forensic Risk. Simon is a certified data privacy expert in the company, conducting forensic accounting with 20 years experience in investigations, financial crime, and regulatory inquiries. He also advises clients on the design, implementation, and testing of compliance programs. So hello to all the panel, and thank you very much for watching at home. This is going to be a 45-minute panel in total, with about 35 minutes of discussion and then questions, and hopefully some answers as well from the panel. So if you have any questions, please just go to the bottom of the video, and there should be a comment box where you can put in your questions to the panel. We'll try to get through as many as we can at the end. So we'll start off then. We talked about this in a bit of preparation, didn't we, chaps? The premise of this panel is that big brands are affected by breaches. But my question to you is, and it's a little bit facetious, deliberately, are they really affected? Because I cover this sort of thing all the time, and small and medium companies, yes, they can and do go bankrupt. We've seen that before, but big brands, they can be hacked, they can pay off hackers in the millions and seemingly carry on as normal. What are the actual negatives here? Can you start us off, Cosimo?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very happy here at the panel. Let's start with my assumption, which is the following. Pay is not always a good way of handling those kind of accidents. Of course, it's not sustainable in a long-term business strategy. Often we forgot, when we look at the most crucial impact of data breach on big brands, it's not only related about the revenue loss, which is clear. Of course, if you have a data breach, probably you will lose some of your revenue. But of course, we should never forget the fact that also the reputation of the brands is in long term can be seriously damaged. Consumers, they really become more and more interesting about how the privacy is protected, their privacy. And of course, there are also other elements we should not forget. Often, particularly now, data breach is not only for an economical reason, they may also have an impact on intellectual property, for example. That means hackers, they are not only interested in personal data, but now hackers, they are more and more interested in intellectual property, because those information is become public, it may be used by your competitor, which means in long term will have a serious impact. The other part, which often we forgot, there are the so-called hidden costs. In addition to lost revenue, which is very dramatic, brand reputation, which is also dramatic, there are costs related, for example, with legal fee in case of claim or action, legal action. Now we have also this class action, which has been introduced by GDPR. That means there are many other elements. Also, the regulatory fine is also another issue. Without not even say about the increasing of the insurance premium, which probably companies have to pay in order to solve issues related with data breach. I think it's not only about big or small company. Of course, small company, they are 60% of the hack actually is concern small and medium enterprise, simply because they are much easy to breach, and that's it. I think will be my comments on the first questions.
Steve, what do you want for?
So you have to remember that I have a slightly skewed perspective because I work in healthcare and life sciences, and that's safety critical infrastructure. It doesn't matter whether you are small or large, the impact of failure of whether it's a particularly a ransomware attack, something that leads to downtime of your services, even if data is stolen as a part of that attack, has a profound impact on patient outcomes, on the ability to provide clinical services. You think, for example, now we were discussing before, the vaccines that are being rolled out in the UK have to be stored in hospitals. If that hospital is hit by a ransomware attack, it could be devastating for at least a short period of time for the rollout of a vaccine. Now, imagine you are the chief executive of that healthcare organization. Imagine you're the manufacturer of the medical device that was the source of the vulnerability. Imagine if you're a government who is already having a challenge reputationally in terms of management of something like the pandemic. A cyber attack can have a profound impact throughout the value chain, frankly. So for me, I definitely see a magnitude in terms of difference between a very small organization and a large organization. But actually, I think the larger organizations, if you're in a safety critical space, is actually that much more profound. And if you're an executive and you're selfish just about your own reputation, having a major failure when you're in charge of a large organization because you didn't invest in security is going to haunt you for a long time.
Yes, I accept that. But there are also so many examples, are there not, of companies like, I don't know, let's look at Twitter that was obviously hacked really seriously earlier this year. Huge security mishandling in terms of the VPN was apparently shonky, which meant that a bit of social engineering and somebody managed to get the access to the behind the scenes panel, which means that they could tweet from any account on Twitter. By any metric, that is a huge security failure. But Simon, Twitter's still going. Twitter seems to be fine. So what are the real risks to a big brand that has a breach?
I think there's a few things here, and there's one thing I think we need to all, we think about breaches, and they're the things that are really kind of hitting the press. I think the other thing that I think there are other things that are going to happen as this, if you like, this kind of market mature, and as the regulators and the government enforcers start to look at this more closely. And it's not just, this might be particularly something that Saif with his background might be able to comment on as well. But I think we need to look here not just when data is lost through breach, but also when data is misused. So I think that is a big area where brands are building. I mean, you only have to look at Apple. Apple is selling their iPhones based on the strength of their security. How secure is this product? How much respect do we treat your data with? And it's not just can we repel, the sort of evil forces of the state actors that are trying to get into your iPhone, but also, that we're not going to misuse your data. We're going to use it, and respect it for the purposes that you gave it to us in the first place. And we're starting to see, that kind of developing. I mean, were it not for COVID, the UK Information Commissioner was looking really closely at the ad tech industry, just right up until the COVID crisis hit, and looking at that kind of real-time bidding, kind of industry where data is being harvested from a ton of different sources to put those, kind of advert in the advertising slots on your screen, where's that data coming from? How is it being used? How is it being harvested? How are you, as a big brand, lending yourself? And when you're making those micro bids to place that advert in front of, Simon Taylor, who seems to be really interested in this pair of sports shoes, for example, how are you lending yourself to that? And that's where you're going to get, major sort of knock-on and ripple effects. I mean, this goes beyond. I mean, the breaches are really important. Obviously, I think everything that Cosmo and SafeSec, is really, really important, because the fines are going to get bigger. The cost of remediation is going to get greater. The class actions are going to come out of this. We haven't even really started to see those yet. BA and Marriott have both got class actions, kind of rolling through the court. And, this is going to make big brands sit up and pay real attention, because this is now, instead of it being a kind of relatively low level, issue that's dealt with in a technical way, this is now getting right up to some kind of C-suite attention. So, sorry, I think I probably just rattled off a whole load of stuff, and in a way changed the point of attack a bit, because I think we have to think about misuse as well as data loss through cyber attacks. I think these are two things that are going to go hand in hand as we move forward with government investigation, government enforcement.
I think you touched on a good point there. When you say the misuse of data, I'm thinking straight away of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which, although Facebook is a very strong company, extremely rich, growing all the time, there is now a trust issue there, isn't there, with its staff? With its customers. Gal, do you think that is a sort of firm example we have of a massive brand that has been affected by a breach?
Definitely. In my perspective, the main issue with data breaches and privacy scandals is the fact that it hurts the company brand reputation. It takes years to build a trustworthy brand, right? But it takes a few minutes to ruin it. And in recent years, consumers started to be more sensitive to doing business with companies that are not taking their data security and privacy seriously, with more and more consumers that are affected by data breaches and experience identity theft and reputation damage or a manipulation. In the case of Cambridge, their attitude to doing business with online companies is changing as they become more and more suspicious about who they do business with. So what is really get hurt is the brand reputation, both in the short and the long term.
And Danny, I'll bring us on to the next question, if that's okay. What are the scenarios of data breaches then that keep you up at night the most? Is it the ransomwares? Is it the business email compromise? What are the things that you really do worry about for your clients?
And I think there's the difference in the smaller business, the small enterprise, the medium enterprise. You see things like ransomware completely toppling those businesses, and that's not because they can't pay. Because I've seen so many small businesses pay and not get their data back. It's because that they tend not to have the security controls that the bigger enterprise do in place. So it's not difficult to get ransomware in the big organizations, but it's difficult to make as bigger impact in the organization throughout. Now, breaches, on the other hand, as a big organization, is much, much worse. And yes, you're not going to see Bank of America topple because someone had a data breach. You're not going to see Facebook topple because of a data breach. You're going to see reputation damage. But you are going to see heads roll in the company. You are going to see departments restructured, people losing their jobs. And I think IT managers, CISOs being fired. And there's kind of a joke that when you hire a CISO, he's there to be fired in a big company, because his head rolls when it all goes to crap and somebody breaches. But as a small business, you have to worry about failure, normally not because you don't have a big enough checkbook, normally because it's much easier to take out 500 computers and all of the data and the secondary backup than it is to take out the 500,000 computers in a massive organization, because normally those organizations have sets of divisions. But there are, and I've seen in big organizations, some pretty big damages that don't necessarily always come to life with things like ransomware, where they might lose an investment part of their business where they have all their investment data and they never manage to recover that back. Or they might lose a R&D center where they've lost all like 5 years R&D. And yes, it doesn't make the business fail because the businesses are collectively, they're almost like an entire group of businesses inside themselves. So it's easier for them to stay running, but it does hurt them, and it hurts those divisions. So I almost think as a large enterprise, as each division, you have to think of myself as its own entity, and could my entity inside this business disappear? And ransomware, of course, is the obvious one, but ransomware doesn't just look like encrypting your files and asking for a payment, but it also looks like stealing your files, threatening to dump them on the web. I mean, if you're Bank of America or Home Depot and somebody says, oh, give me $1 million, I'm going to post all your customers' credit cards. As a small business, you actually have a little bit more freedom to do that. Home Depot can't do that because then it's a cover-up. So you can't even pay that money. You've got to say, okay, well, we've just reached all your credit cards, and that's a huge issue.
That's a good, interesting point. Yeah, so you're saying that the small and medium-sized businesses, a breach could actually bring them down because they can't afford it or they can't cope with it. Whereas the big brands, although it might not bring them down, it's more serious. Cosimo, what are the things that keep you up at night at the moment? You know, what are you seeing in your world that's really concerning in terms of breaches?
And, I think we should make a reflection here. We have to contextualize these issues. Do we have a cybersecurity because we need to protect the privacy of individuals? That means the privacy is a fundamental right. That means the implementation of cybersecurity measure has been always perceived or has been always seen as a cost for the industry. And for this reason, probably has been often neglected, because we were mentioning big names like Facebook or Twitter, whatever. There is an issue. There is clearly a competition issue. There are monopolistic market. I think if the distrust of the consumers become larger and larger, probably new entity, new services that will emerge, because consumers, as we say, we are mature. And also, has been mentioned, class action. In Europe, we will have very soon a new directive on class action, which will harmonize, because so far there is also legal fragmentation that not in every country in Europe is allowed the collective representation of interest. Now, do we have a new directive now there, which will harmonize and make sure that even GDPR class action will become really real? The other issues, I think, nowadays when we talk about privacy, we cannot have a privacy without cybersecurity. This is the dilemma. How do you protect the individual rights if you don't have a cybersecurity measure in place? Now, the question is, because of this digitalization, which is becoming more and more, is increasing, we are always indirectly exposed to major risk, to new cyber risk and cyber attack. That means we should intend the cybersecurity not longer as a technological option which a company can adopt or not. Now we have to see cybersecurity as a societal benefit. Just because every of us, due to the high digitalization, we are exposed to more risk. That means this old approach from company, even big brands often have to say, that means that the cybersecurity was just taken into account only when vulnerability were identified. This is not any longer the case. It can happen at any level. Some of you have mentioned the critical infrastructure. This is really big issues there. These are services of general interest. That means it's very important to humanity. And these are the issues there, which I think we should go away of this cybersecurity as a technological option. We should now talking about cybersecurity as a societal need, which is.
And when you talk about critical services there, Safe, I sort of like to bring it to you if that's okay, because I imagine the sort of data that you're protecting with your work is the most sensitive you can imagine, and possibly some of the most critical. What are the things that you're seeing that are really concerning?
I mean, not sound like a broken record. It's ransomware. It really is. I mean, just a few weeks ago, the FBI.
I think, from my perspective, as a reporter in this field, that's the thing that I'm concentrating on the most. And I sometimes worry that I'm missing out on other areas. Yeah. You're saying it's ransomware as well.
I mean, just a few weeks ago, the FBI and CISA in the United States issued an alert warning of the Ryuk ransomware attack targeting hospitals across the United States, a national security alert, effectively. And I want to come back to Danny's point. In healthcare, it's easier to knock over a a GP surgery, or in the US, a small physician practice. But actually, the biggest bang for buck is to target your biggest brand health system that has 100 hospitals in it, where you can really spread and do a huge ransomware attack, because there's so much more on the line if you can have a successful ransomware attack there. That's the first thing I would say. But actually, the area that concerns me in the future is tampering and altering or scrambling clinical data at scale. So imagine you get into a hospital system and you mix together all the blood test results just randomly. It's not a targeted attack. You just get in there and mix it all together. There's actually a study in Israel, Ben Gurion University, couple of years back, where they created a type of malware where they created cancer nodules on CT scans, and radiologists, 95% of them said, yeah, looks like a cancer on this scan, but it was all, it was fake. I call those clinical integrity extortion attacks. I think that's the future. So that's where attackers are going to evolve. They recognize the sense of patient safety, clinical urgency. They understand in different sectors, whether it's aviation, national grids, healthcare, that where there is urgency and where security maturity hasn't matched up with digital maturity, there's room to play and cause serious damage and get the payouts that they want. That's what I'm seeing, and that's the combination of things that keeps me up at night.
That's pretty scary, isn't it? The idea that you could hold a hospital to ransom or whatever by saying, look, we're going to make it so your patients don't believe their test results. That's scary. Gal, sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say, it's not even to do with, if it sounds really wrong, but forget the patients for a moment, not trusting their blood test results. The clinicians not being able to trust their results and then don't know how to manage their patients.
Yeah. Gal, let's go in on the same direction that SAFE's taken us then. What do you think is the real concern for maybe, I don't know, in the next 5 years?
So I would want to touch the COVID situation that started almost a year ago. So since I'm representing the consumer side here, so since COVID started, the worldwide lockdown, the social distancing, and the remote work have forced the majority of the world to move their entire offline life to online, right? We can't easily go to the nearest grocery store anymore or to the mall. This means that people are signing up to a lot of new services as well as purchasing much more online. My company, Mine, has actually published a research about it in Business Insider, in which we discovered that people's sensitive data exposure grew by 55% since COVID started, which is massive. And the average number of companies that are holding consumer-sensitive data before COVID was 350. And now it's almost reaching 550, which is massive. And we also identified more than 90% increasement in sharing sensitive identity and health data, which means that consumers are at higher risk for their data being stolen and used against them than ever before, as well as companies. And lastly, also the reality proves that if you look at the recent Verizon data breach investigation report, hackers are leveraging this new reality as well, as data breaches and privacy scandals are increasing dramatically just in the last year.
Simon, do you think we're in the present now, talking about the present, so do you think COVID has increased the risk?
I think it undoubtedly has. I mean, we now, even just looking at ourselves as a firm, we have had to take, a lot of steps. We have an investigations practice. We have a government investigations practice where we're helping companies respond to government-led investigations. And of course, we hold a lot of sensitive data that's being collected as part of that investigation. And now we have, instead of having certain access points, in our main offices around the world, which might total, 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 different access points, we now have hundreds and hundreds of different access points, all with varying degrees of security. So, we've absolutely had to up our game and to make sure that we can provide the assurances that our client want and deserve in this new kind of reality, this new normal. I think also just to go back and got to your kind of original question, which I do think is worth pausing on. And I think the points that are made by the panel so far excellent and completely behind them. But I think one thing we've got to go, just rolling right the way back to the beginning of a lot of these breaches. It's us. It's human beings. We're oftentimes the weakest link in all of this. And you only have to look at, take the British Airways case as an example. We have, a lot of good information there about how that breach took place, and it didn't take place, because of a brute force attack on BA systems. It occurred because some user credentials were compromised, and it wasn't user credentials of British Airways employees that were compromised. It was employees of a third party. So it was employees of Swissport, based in Trinidad and Tobago, 5 accounts, and they were compromised. We don't know how they were compromised. We don't know whether those people gave up their login credentials willingly or perhaps for some sort of reward. But it took 5 people in Trinidad and Tobago working for Swissport to give up their user credentials to enter through Citrix, BA's environment. And that's how the breach started. And partly because BA didn't have, hadn't locked down Swissport's access to the rest of their IT systems, that Swissport was able to break out, the hackers were able to break through the barriers between the Swissport access and the BA access and get into the whole of the BA infrastructure. So, where it goes back to, you kind of roll it all the way back to something pretty simple, which is human beings, being compromised, handing over their login credentials, and not even people that you employ. So I think companies have got to take, and we've seen this, the parallels between, what's happening here in the data security and data privacy, world are just so similar to what we've seen in all sorts of other types of investigations where, companies get into trouble, whether it's anti-money laundering, whether it's anti-bribery and corruption, just screams out the same things time and time again, which is, human beings, your third-party networks, all of those sorts of things are at the heart of it. So, there's got to be a real joined-up approach here from companies in trying to, sort of lock down, you've got to lock down systems on the technical side, but there's also a lot of soft stuff to do here around your employees and the management of your third parties.
Danny, speaking of the human risk factor, are you seeing things during the pandemic be harder? Because all the things that Simon just said, that weak link, some people are arguing that weak link is even worse now because we're asking more of our employees. We're asking them to use VPNs they're not used to, or different devices that they haven't got their work, details on. Someone in the preparation for this panel, I think it was Gal, said, bring your own device is like bring your own disaster. Do you agree with that, Danny?
Absolutely. And I think as we've seen, there's a few issues that are unfolding. Humans are always the weakest link. And, my opinion as a security professional is always you have to wrap as many controls around humans as possible to make sure they make less mistakes. And so if you're concerned about somebody's password being phished, make sure there's dual factor authentication so that when it is phished, there's something in place. Make sure they're being changed frequently so that damage is limited to a certain period of time. Make sure you're not letting users run things that they shouldn't be able to run because they clicked on a link in an email. And I'm very much about controls. Humans are definitely the biggest link, and being at home has caused this whole shadow IT thing going on. People installing TeamViewer on their work computers so they can come in from home. And now there's this huge entry point into the corporate network. You've got, the corporate firewall kind of died a long time ago because so many people were working from home and working remotely anyway. But now you've gone from 20% of people working remotely outside the corporate firewall and 80% inside to the other way around, where 80% are working outside the corporate firewall. Those controls that were at the firewall level have now been removed. They're relying on security at the endpoint. People have the stupidest things going on in the houses, everything from light switches to kids playing games and teenagers doing things they shouldn't be. And now we've gone from that, and they're doing whatever they want because they're sitting at home, they're bored, they think they can log in via TeamViewer, they can install their own PDF software. None of this is managed, and it's now opening more and more vulnerabilities. And we're seeing a lot more ransomware as a result of that. We're seeing a lot more breaches. and we're seeing a lot more entry points. And to Suresh's point, into hospitals is very, very common to getting to those environments, and there's big money in healthcare.
Cosimo, one of the things that I often think about is when we bear all this in mind, all the risks that we have, how does a company go about choosing the right products? Because the market for vendors is long. Have you got any principles, and I'll ask the rest of the group, are there any principles with which you think someone watching this talk who's perhaps considering beefing up security or maybe starting a whole new security framework, what should the starting point be?
This is a big issue, actually, because, companies nowadays, they are really compressed between the emerging obligation derived by privacy legislation, which is basically, it's the responsibility of control and managing data to put in place technical security measure, which has to be appropriate to the nature of the data, the size of the company, whatsoever. On the other side, there is clearly, and if you look at the last report of the European Commission cybersecurity strategy, there is a lacking of cybersecurity experts. According to the last report, which is really dated a few months ago, we still see that we are missing in Europe like 350,000 cybersecurity experts just in Europe in terms of skills. And the problem is 2022 is probably tomorrow. We are already 2021 in a few days. That means how we can do these things. Of course, I agree with what has been said before, even by also by Simon Taylor. Say, look, the major problem now, users they play a critical role in an organization when we talk about security. How you can pretend that if your staff or employees, they are not trained in terms, they are not aware about what are the security risks. Everybody say, okay, remote work. Also there, I want to open a little parenthesis, if I may allow 30 seconds. I'm always talking about definition. We hear all the time now, social distance, what actually means. Between me and your queen, probably there is a social distance. Let's also name it as should be. It's a simply distance. That means people, they are physical distant. The same goes for remote work. In many countries, if I look at Italy, we name this the remote work as smart work. I do not see anything smart there. Simply companies that were just blamed by the COVID, they asked people working from home, which led, as then was said, to many mistakes because companies that were not even prepared to that. Now, how do we overcome these things? And this is the main issue. And also, when you look at the market, there is clearly a growing of the asymmetry between the know-how to commit a crime. You can even buy a malware on the deep web or the dark web, and the knowledge you need and the skill you need inside of the company to protect against those possible attacks. I think this is the main issues. Another issue, of course, is how we can define now cybersecurity expert. What kind of competence, what kind of skills those individuals have to have. The Commission is still struggling to design a profile of cybersecurity. Whatever you need from ENISA, for example, which is the cybersecurity agency for the European Union, they clearly say that we will need a new type of people with a multidisciplinary mix. Between the technical knowledge, of course, has to be there, but on the other hand, we need also interdisciplinary skills and competence like social science and legal matter. We should be clear on that. The future manager or the future leader in company, they should be people which they do understand the data management. They do understand what does it mean for leadership, because in near future, both from public sector or from private sector, the new leader in terms of business development, they should understand if they need an algorithm, if they need a machine, or if they need humans. How you can do these things if you don't have exactly those new skills? If you look what the market offers in terms of leader, there is a clear gap. Another issue which I want to point out, and then I close, also look at this panel. There is also a gender problem here, because when you look also there at the workforce, clearly, I've been in some conference with 500 people. I think there were only 16 female people there. Because IT, we have to say, it's really dominated by male, which is not good, I think.
Yeah, that's true. We did a really good panel on that, actually, a couple of days ago in this conference. We got together and we chewed over what the problem is with gender diversity in cybersecurity. We've only got, I'd like to get to the questions. We've had 5 really good questions, and if you've got any more, then please drop them in the comments, because we're going to get through them. But I just wanted to, if I can, go back to that question, and if we could go through the panel quite quickly. Safe, what are your kind of, let's say, 3 principles for how you should go about choosing the right products and security measures that a company should take?
Number 1, don't invest in products if you haven't made a plan to invest in your people and processes first, because it'll sit on the shelf and not be successful. Number 2, if you're looking into the market for a specific product, look at vendors who have shown and demonstrated an understanding of your sector. So, I'm fortunate, I work with some of the largest tech companies in the world, advising them. And I say to them, if you're going to play in healthcare, you better have demonstrated you understand the operations of a hospital, of a pharma company, and your products are tailored for that. You can't just take something that used for financial services and direct it into healthcare. And third, irrespective of your position, try to get that board level engagement, because the board level engagement is going to open up the funding routes for you, and it's going to give you the long-term strategic buy-in you need to not just buy the products, but to enforce them and apply them successfully over time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I imagine the panel agrees with Safe's principles there. Have you got any more that you could just give the audience before we move on to questions?
One of the things I would always suggest is a lot of security is focused about more detection, more get me a better this, get me a better that, as opposed to holes in place. And if you approach things like I have to deal with a threat, as opposed to I have to limit privilege, limit what applications can run, limit what applications can do, you're chasing this huge area of bad guys. And if you narrow it down to, let's look at, first of all, what users need permissions to, shrink that to as much as they need and no more, then you take your surface area of attack massively reduced, and you're not sitting there praying that your antivirus, your SOC is going to detect this bad guy. And then if you say, okay, what applications do people need, and limit it to that, you take away the shadow IT, you take away the malware being able to run because it's not on that list, rather than saying, let's try and block 1 million pieces of new bad malware a day. We're just going to allow 5 pieces of software that we run and nothing else. If you change your thinking from everything's trusted unless I think they're bad to nothing's trusted unless I know it's good, then you take away the guesswork. So I always try and encourage this, and the governments and the CIS and NIST and all of these standards are starting to move in this direction. If, in my opinion, 10 years too late, but operate more on a zero trust model and expand from there, as opposed to trust everything and try and decrease from there, because it's very, very hard to find every bad thing out there. It's much easier to look at what you need, what permissions your users need, what applications your users need, and say, we're going to start at that point and everything else gets blocked. And you're then in control of your environment instead of trying to hire a huge team of security professionals to find the bad guys.
Brilliant. Thank you, Danny. Simon, I saw you nodding there. Have you got any other sort of core principles that you'd like to share?
Well, I think what I'm whether they're core principles or not, I'm not quite sure whether they're grand enough to be that.
We'll call them
not yet, anyway. But here's the thing. Look, the GDPR refers to technical and organizational measures for a very good reason, and because you can't have kind of one without the other. There's no point in buying, as I think has already been said, a whole suite of technical, stuff that you put on the shelf and it does nothing. And I think what's been, what has been generally quite is that there's at least a growing acknowledgement as to what counts as the right technical standards, what sort of things kind of tick the right boxes from a technical point of view. I think where there's a huge lag, and it is on the organizational measures and what actually is the right kind of standard of care. What is the organizational standard of care that needs to be put into place here? And I think that's where I think actually coming right back to the title of this, I think that's where big brands can really do something here, because it needs to be led by industry as to getting a kind of industrial, an industry-led standard as to what those organizational measures should look like, and so that everybody can understand what good is, and everybody can benchmark themselves against that. At the moment, I think that a lot of people are going in a ton of different directions and finding it very difficult to enmesh a lot of those technical things that they're doing pretty well actually deep into the governance of the organization itself. And I think that's where we're seeing failure. That's where we are seeing failures, and that's where we'll continue to see failures unless we get some kind of initiative and momentum on that kind of more organizational side. So sorry, I'm not really providing the kind of the silver bullet here, but I think that's the direction we need to go in. I think there's a lot of good movements, on the kind of real sort of tight cyber side, on the technical side, but I think on the organizational side, a lot of work to do, yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
By the way, I have another angle I like to suggest. I'm coming from a long service at the 80-100 unit in Israel, which is part of the Israeli intelligence, the equivalent of the NSA in the US. And all I can say is that no company can really protect itself, right? So I think that companies should change their mindset to think about what happens when the data breach happens and what we should do afterwards. For example, what sensitive data they have, how would they identify this sensitive data fast, and how would they keep their system safe after it happens to minimize the exposure. Following that point, many companies are collecting personal data for the sake of collecting, right? Because they can, and why not? But this creates a lot of hidden risks for them. They think that they would use data for AI or other marketing purposes, but in most cases, this data is kept unused. We help people to leave their data only where they really need. But what if companies would think about data retention policies much harder? I mean, what if companies would delete the unnecessary data they don't need anymore? Why should they keep it for no reason? Because this data is waiting to get hacked. It can be tomorrow, it can be in a week, it can be in a month. So I really suggest to think on what happened when a data breach happens, and to think carefully about data retention policies.
Plan for the worst case scenario. That's a great point as well. Okay, we have 2 minutes and 5 questions. So what I'm going to do is throw them out there. If you feel like you can give us a 30-second answer, raise your hand, okay? Number 1, are there any management or cultural factors that companies who have had the biggest breaches have had in common? I think are their worst case. Yes, go for it, Gal.
I think that everyone mentioned here, it seems like if you analyze all the data breaches, eventually the problem is social engineering and human error. Eventually, the employees, whether it's the company employees or outsource or outsource employees, these are the weakest link. And I think that companies should they invest millions of dollars in cybersecurity products, but they don't invest a lot of time in educating the employees and help increase the awareness to those threats. Because at the end of the day, it's always about clicking a malicious link or downloading a malicious file. So
thank you, Gal. Okay, number 2, what can be done in order to forbid the giant tech companies selling data without the owner's consent with third parties? That's one for the government. Is it? Go on, Simon.
So regulation, I'm afraid. I think we've tried long enough to let them sort their own house out. It's not working. It is regulation, I'm afraid, and it's going to happen.
Yeah. We had a question here, which I think we've answered actually. Are the increased risks of home working really down to COVID or a lack of preparedness for the changing working culture? So I think we have covered that one. I hope we have. Number 4, does the stringency of a country's regulatory environment correlate with a lower instance of corporate data breaches? That's a great question. Anyone come in on that for 20 seconds?
I don't think so. Because the government is always behind and slow at creating policy. And typically most data breaches are not relevant to the company giving data away, as opposed to more poor security practices and poor security hygiene.
Right. Okay, and the final one again. Sorry, did someone jump in?
I'm going to say that's an awesome question. I think Cosimo's team at Maastricht should do some research on it.
Yes, there you go, Marcus. You got some homework. And the last question, again, I think we answered this one.
Can I just say one thing on the last question, so just very telegraphic. Regarding the co-home working, we should not forget the risk for the employee monitoring there. We are talking about what? Big business or big brothers? This is an issue which needs to be discussed separately, probably.
Let's get you back for a whole other panel all about that next time. I like that. That's great. Okay, and the last question, we're 1 minute over. We've already answered this one, but I'll read it out anyway. Do you see, due to COVID home working, the workforce is the increase at vulnerable threat surface an increase in insider threats? I think we have firmly said the answer is yes.
Yes.
Go on, Save. 10 seconds. You're muted.
Danny, you mentioned a point before about wanting to put more controls on people, which is interesting. I've seen the battle that the more controls you apply, the more people, annoying clinicians like me, find workarounds and create even more of a headache. So there's that balance of how do you apply controls and get the behavior change and not get a battle between technical versus end user. I think that's a really interesting challenge from a people perspective as well.
It's a minefield, but luckily the people watching here have got people like you guys to help them through it. Thank you very much to Cosimo Monda, Dr. Saif Abid, Simon Taylor, Danny Jenkins, and Gal Ringel. Thank you very much for watching at home and sending in some great questions as well.